I'm June Reed.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are reading Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal by Rodrigo Nunes. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Whatever. He can come on the show to correct me if I got that wrong. It's a book that was published in May of 2021. And it's pretty damn good. I enjoyed this quite a bit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be...
Yeah. Like, I had a few caveats here or there, but it's like, this is a solid read.
Yeah, really strong read. I feel like, for a lot of books this is the case, but I would recommend readers go and actually read this if they feel it's interesting, because it's very dense, it's very well written, and it's too dense for us to do like a paragraph by paragraph kind of reading of it, where we're going to be skimming through the concepts. But it is, I think even with that, I think it's still well worth picking up and reading in detail, because it's got a lot of stuff in there. It's very well reasoned and well argued. It's also just really interesting to find one of these books that's just like really on our wavelength, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't think we've seen anything from like, well, that we haven't covered Half Earth Socialism yet, but I don't think we've seen anything we've really read on the show or whatever that's been from. Well, actually, sorry, I'm completely wrong. I'm going back through my memory here, and I remember that People's Republic of Walmart was also published by Verso, wasn't it? So that's probably the last one we've done that was like a Verso book that was really on our wavelength. Yeah, but it's been quite few and far between.
Yeah, it's I do enjoy an occasional Verso, but yeah, it's interesting how these things work out. Yeah, and it's been fun to see like the just the familiarity. And it's like I've been fucking saying this all along, God damn, and slam the
table.
That
Totally.
kind of stuff. It's full of that kind of thing. And
Yeah, it's like, it's very weird because it is a sort of 10 years later assessment and critique of the Occupy moment. And I guess, we sort of got started out of that milieu of like, well, what the hell do we do now kind of thinking. But it was quite a bit. It was quite a ways back that we got started there, and to see them sort of like pick up that question 10 years later, it feels a little bit like out of sync with time, but at the same time, like the rejoinder itself feels very contemporary.
It does, right? Yeah, in some ways it felt like, because the book opens the introduction on like, the failures of Occupy and the 2011 sort of wave of struggles and stuff, and like how those struggles kind of broke immediately or like very quickly on like just like non-viability. Like they couldn't hold together. They couldn't hold together in the face of any kind of external pressure. And then he does talk about like the kind of, I guess, like rightward turn or whatever, or the sort of turn back to like the party and all that kind of stuff, and like
the Jody Dean stuff, that kind of thing.
If you squint at it, you can kind of see the DSA stuff in there, right? Like the kind of, and the revival of Leninism and all that kind of shit. But he doesn't dwell a lot on that. It is kind of centered on 2011 and onward. And I think in part as well because like things have only gotten worse. It seems, in terms of like the author's very critical of like the sort of fetish of horizontalism from those days and how that's still kind of with us. But he's also critical of the fetish of verticalism and the sort of party form and all that kind of stuff, the Leninist kind of revival, tribute band stuff. But he's really kind of critical of this, the pendulum swings, right? Like it's like, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck doing the duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season thing with the posters, right? Like just back and forth. That like the left overall is stuck in this kind of mode of oscillation between these two poles of like vertically integrated like party stuff or totally dispersed horizontal kind of anarchisty sort of the multitude, you know, riot porn kind of stuff, and seem to not be able to integrate those kind of things. And it kind of, the big question here is the question of organization, right? Like, I mean, if we're going to get anything done, we need to be organized. Are either of these camps right about anything? Not really. Like, they're both half right and half wrong. And the kind of, the way to reconcile this is to think seriously about organization in both vertical and horizontal modes, in this kind of mixed mode, and to not do this oscillation.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very elementary theoretical move to say, you know,
The golden mean, right? Of sorts.
well, it's not even the golden mean. It's just, it's like, hey, what if, you know, the sort of horizontal pole of politics and the vertical pole of politics were on a spectrum, and you could sort of have any number of positions along that spectrum, right? Like, it's not like a super like heavy duty intellectual judo kind of move, right? Like, it's just like,
No.
oh yeah, like something so basic but like apparently impossible to grasp for a good period of leftist history. And I think that when he like gets into the details of sort of like why philosophically this has been so hard to grasp, it's quite interesting. But the move itself, if you were like sort of thinking about it abstractly, is quite simple.
Yeah, right. Like, if you were to show this to, like, if you were to show the argument to, like, your average, I don't know, fucking economist reader or somebody who reads the FT or whatever, they would say, yeah, of course. Well, what are you saying? You know, there's nothing here. You know?
Well, yeah, or just like if you presented it in a sense, like in a context that wasn't about like political organizing, it was just like, oh, you have term A, you have term B. What if there was a spectrum between these two terms? Like, that is not like in itself terribly complicated. But once you get it into a sort of historical political context and an ideological context, then it becomes something that you need a full length book to actually dig into, which is a little depressing, but you know, it's still a quite a good effort, and of course it really rhymes with Beer's critique of centralization and decentralization as a false dichotomy.
Yeah, absolutely right. That's what it was reminding me of all along, right? Through reading this whole thing. I guess the other kind of, well, it's a related thing that's definitely under critique here as the left's tendency towards kind of prescriptive approaches to politics, right? Like, you get these two camps, but also like each of them is kind of thinking in terms of how things should be, like the prescribing the form of the party that must be applied, or, you know, on the other side, prescribing the form of the multitudinal riot that must be applied or whatever. And the author here has this much more like just very practical and like complex ecological kind of approach to thinking about these kind of things, that like actual conflicts on the ground give rise to various social forces rather than being about choosing between two forms, you know, that you have to prescribe.
Yeah, yeah, you have these two reified forms of politics that don't relate to anything that actually exists in reality, or is exactly possible in any situation, but are just like held up as ideal models that have to be implemented, and your only choice is between A or B if you're a lefty. And you know, maybe you throw sock dem politics in there somewhere. It's yeah, like it is a very impractical approach to organization, because it's not really about organization. It's about partisan affiliation and about, I guess, like the desire for clear and simple solutions, right? That like, oh, well, if I reduce the variety of this problem down to A or B, then I only have two choices to worry about, right? Like that it provides like sort of pseudo answers to problems that have like a low variety to them but are completely useless at the same time.
Yeah, like what we're warned about. So it's like the 1-bit channels or whatever, where it's like it's crushed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's crushed the variety to such an extent that like you do get this very highly quantized, unambiguous. Like it's an unambiguous answer, but the answer is either 0 or 1, right? There's no actual information there.
Yeah, and any useful answer would be something in between those values.
Yeah, like a fucking floating point value or some kind of thing. So, in opposition to that prescriptive kind of approach to politics, the author's taking a much more practical kind of thing and looking at how things actually are. Like, how does political organization actually go about? And so he's looking at it in terms of like, you know, instead of this opposition between organization and spontaneity, he's seeing a kind of continuity of like, you know, natural organization through to intentional organization, and that like everything in the universe is organized in some way. Like it's you can't really claim that there's spontaneous stuff which is unorganized and then there's organized stuff which is not spontaneous. Like it's just not how reality works. Real systems are a complex mesh of bits that are more organized than others, bits that are more dispersed, and bits that are just mixed, and bits that change over time, that become more structured, that lose their structure, that blend and mix into each other. And yeah, like even that kind of split between. Yeah, like I do love this thing where he has the continuum from natural to intentional organization, where even if you're not intentionally organizing something, or like basically in these social movements or in these political movements, individuals who are not in parties or are not card-carrying members of a union, they are still organizing, right? They are still organized. Organization is still happening even in the absence of, you know, capital O organizations with dues and cards and shit like that. It's super important.
Yes, yes. Yeah. It's like organization is everywhere, which is the sort of like heavy duty ontological work that Nunes is doing here.
It's very Pickering in that sense, right? Like, and it's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's coming out of cybernetics and systems theory, complexity theory, all that kind of stuff, but trying to provide rejoinder to the sort of anarchist leaning everything is spontaneously self-organizing, therefore we don't need to do anything, sort of like wishful thinking.
Yeah, because like I guess because those failures are more recent, right? Like that the most recent wave has been this horizontal fetish anarchist inflected stuff, and it's failed miserably. So that's the kind of thing that's more vigorously under attack here, because he'll spend more paragraphs talking about like the desperate need to take organization seriously and go beyond this like local only fetish of organizing. He's also very critical of, you know, party Leninist fucking dead enders or whatever, but their failures are so far in the past that it's not even worth talking about in some ways, you know. the fetish we're stuck in. Well, yeah, this is the bit where we've been talking about that's kind of missing is the kind of more recent years of the turn to the DSA and the turn to the Corbyn's Labour and stuff like that as like back to the party. And it is interesting that that's kind of absent.
Or just sort of, the various sectlets on the Leninist model that have like recruited people in the time since Occupy. They still exist, right? They're still happening. It's not that they're not around. It's just that they have political relevance outside of the left, I guess you would say. Yeah. Like, whereas, I don't know, making community gardens, I suppose, has at least some like local political relevance on the other end of the spectrum. You know, somebody who isn't in the left would actually have to interact with people doing that sort of thing, as opposed to the sectlets that are just like purely internally preoccupied, right?
Yeah, they're monadic. You don't really get any contact with them. I guess maybe the kind of the reason this is another big theme in the book, right? That like the left sort of turned away from organization in the sort of vertical sense, or like it became a dirty word, right? Like organization, and so there was a big turn towards this horizontal fetish, and that was a trauma response, basically. That like the traumas and failures of the 1917 through to 1960 or whatever kind of period were so visceral and so traumatic that it prompted a very strong pendulum swing in the opposite direction. And then it also turned out that the opposite direction didn't work either. And that it just happens to be that failure is more recent and is more palpable. And so when the author is saying we have to actually blend these things and be serious about how organization as a natural phenomenon actually functions, it is a swing back towards the vertical, but he's not aiming for total verticalism. He's aiming for a sensible kind of blended model where we can actually consider all of all of the ways that organization actually functions in the world.
Yeah, some degree of like thinking about organization as something that exists everywhere, and then what kinds of organization would actually be effective in achieving the goals of leftists or people who are looking for emancipation, and in a way that isn't susceptible to sort of asymmetrical capture by a small number of actors, right?
Yeah, and like seeing organization as an enabling condition for action, and as you said, being on guard against corruption, but like seeing it as an enabling condition is a big step away from where a lot of the left seems to be now, which is seeing organization as exclusively dangerous and toxic. Cool. So chapter 1 is towards a theory of political organization, where he gets into a lot of this kind of confusion between organizations and the party versus spontaneity, which I guess, one of the big lessons here is that like organization is not solely about building organizations, like with a big O. Like it's not about building the party, nor is it about totally dispersed, miasma kind of action that a lot of anarchists are quite fond of fetishizing. But it's also like, when your Leninists come on the scene and they say no, the one and only answer is to build the party, they're fucking wrong.
Yeah, right. Because it really sidesteps the question of like, is this an appropriate mode of organization for our circumstances? Does this achieve the goals that it ostensibly sets out to achieve? It's just, organization, like, as a sort of like slogan to shout in response to let's all do vegetable gardens, as a program of politics.
Yeah. And like early on in the chapter, he kind of draws out like the various meanings of the word organization. Like you can kind of list out like first meaning as like capital O organization as like a named noun, like the Labour Party or the Communist Party. You know, these kind of like fully, identified singular things. But there's also organization in the sense of like the activity of individuals, like organization as a verb, right? Like the activity of both individuals and groups organizing life. The vegetable gardens are also organization, and that they organize social life.
Yeah, like they are organized actually, and depending on the scale you're looking at, or the scope you're looking at, like they can seem fairly centralized in themselves. These small organizations are not necessarily of a completely different kind than larger organizations, and they they can sort of intentionally prevent themselves from growing so as to avoid having much effect on anything. But then at that level, like what's the point? Right? It's kind of like, well, if you're intentionally being ineffective because you don't want the organization you have to be too large, then you're just kind of engaging in a masturbatory politics of like, well, let's organize, but also let's not organize.
Yeah, and that's where the fetish of spontaneity really gets its grip, right? Like that, it's a kind of way of disavowing. It's a way of shying away from again this trauma response, right? Like a kind of way of shying away from something you don't want to get into, by saying, "Oh no, this is just spontaneous," right? Like it's this weird kind of deflection or disavowal.
Yeah, it's a disavowal. That's right. It's like, no, we're not actually organized. Like this is spontaneous. But it's like, but like you got like, I don't know, you've got a board. You like you have an AGM. Like you like I don't know. You've got representatives to talk to the city council. Like, how are you not organized? It's just a bizarre way to think. Yeah.
And I think that the claim here then is that like even the spontaneous is organized. Like it's the way these words get thrown around is a meaningless kind of distinction. Like they're two facets of the same process, like the process of organization. And that, like as you said, like at relative scales, you'll get, depending on where you zoom into, things might seem more diffuse or more concentrated. They'll seem looser or more tightly connected. And this is just the way reality functions, right? Because nothing in reality is unorganized. Everything is in a process of organizing.
Yeah. So there's a quote from the introduction that I just wanted to read, because it says, organization is not just a danger, but an enabling condition. What gives each individual the possibility of expanding their limited capacity to act by pooling resources with others, constituting a collective capacity to act and extending its duration over time. And it's just, again, it's really quite an obvious statement when you put it down, but if you pose it in terms of the gulag or the multitude, then it's quite easy to side with the multitude against the gulag, right? Like it's like, okay, like we're not going to organize at all, despite if we thought about it in terms of like we want to achieve something, realizing that organization is sort of required as a force multiplier to achieve anything at all.
Yeah. I think that quote's a really good way of getting us to the what the fuck are the terms potentia versus potestas that are introduced in chapter 1. This is borrowed from Spinoza, if I'm not wrong.
I think you're right. It's two terms that get used a lot in this book. And it's kind of the thing where it's like this is still a Verso book in the sense that like it's still very like engaged with it's engaged with like the vocabulary and the sort of jargon of theory, even though it's not really like a theory wank book, right? Like it's not your sort of typical Verso thing. It's actually trying to say something useful. But it's still using some of the the tools of theory to discuss these things and sort of engaging in that like internal left discourse.
So let me just have a quick look. Like the would it be fair to say that like potestas is like power, concretized power, like state power, the police, army, and like just power, and that
it's like when you have a potential and it manifests and then it sort of calcifies and ossifies and becomes a rigid structure that serves the interests of those that are in power. That's potestas, right? So potentia becomes potestas. So, potentia is sort of like, the 1905 revolution, and then potestas is Stalin,
yeah,
right?
exactly right.
Is to put it in very simple terms, right?
And like the thing here is that like the weak only have potentia, they don't have potestas, and so that means it is necessary for the weak to organize, the weak in quotes or whatever, like people without power must organize to amplify their potentia to be able to challenge potestas. Again, pretty straightforward stuff. Like if you show it to somebody who reads the fucking Economist or whatever, they'll just go, yeah, sure, what the fuck's the point? Like, what are you getting at here? But it's pretty straightforward stuff that like you can't really get anywhere on your own. Being in a position of not having power just necessitates organizing to amplify power. Organizing in that way, it restricts, it sort of coordinates your actions, and coordination is a form of like constriction. There's a certain reduction of freedom in some way, but there's a massive amplification of your ability to challenge power and get the goods, right?
Yeah, because if it's totally unstructured, like it's literally just Brownian motion, and like that's not what it's like. Just maximum entropy, right? And that's not what Nunes is saying we find in social life. Like actually, there is organization towards various ends. And so it's not like we exist in a state of like just total atomization. But if you were to sort of take it to the extreme, that's what you would get, is just maximum entropy. It's just shit moving around randomly with no end at all.
Yeah. The and like the mention of Brownian motion kind of reminded me of like and I'm not sure if I coined this or if it's if it's something that bounced around in my head or if I got it from somewhere, but like the notion of like the maximally horizontalist kind of theory of revolution being a kind of like Boltzmann brain theory of revolution, where like like Boltzmann proposed that like from just random quantum fluctuations by sheer chance, a fully formed human brain could just materialize out of nowhere in the void, and it would have one thought and then immediately die and decay away, and that's kind of just it reminds me so much of like, and this is stuff that the author will get to criticizing, but like the kind of the faith in that happening, there's like the revolution will happen randomly through Brownian motion, is very much a Boltzmann brain kind of theory of revolution. It's just the revolution's gonna spontaneously emerge fully formed from quantum fluctuations, you know?
Yeah, it's a pure singularity, right? Like it happens without any obvious precedent, and it just exists, and then it never becomes potestas because it's just this moment of like absolute liberation, like a pure line of flight, and that's it.
And it's like it's acausal, right? That's the thing, is because it's not causally connected to anything. It's just this weird.
Well, because it's a singularity, like there's no cause you can associate it with. It just emerges instantaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next section, called "Acting Together," of this chapter, kind of goes over, like, I guess, like, basically, like, there's a couple of different ways that people act together, like, in this kind of very high level sense. We have aggregate action, and which is, I guess you'd say, is the horizontal kind. Collective action, which is the kind of vertical sort of kind. And then, but in actuality, the way things actually work in society and in real social movements is distributed action, which is this mixed sort of mode where it's not entirely.
Oh, I was just gonna say the aggregate form is like exactly what Marx was referring to when talking about the peasantry as a sack of potatoes. Like they're just a heap of totally heterogeneous, non-communicative atoms.
Right. It's aggregate action being like when society changes, but just purely through the aggregate effect of individual changes. The example that's given early here is like the sexual revolution, or just like the general, Brownian motion wandering towards the acceptance of gay people or whatever. Like which is. But like later, like the author will point out that actually no, that the way that revolution actually happened was much more of the mixed, the distributed action, where it was a combination of, like, I don't know, individual people getting slightly less homophobic over time for no particular reason, and also organized action on the part of gay people. Like to pretend that the collective action was absent entirely would be crazy, right? Like there were, and as again we can see that, like, depending on where you zoom into and what time period you're talking about, things are more or less concentrated, more or less organized. Various people are involved in various activities that are more or less organized than each other, but that doesn't mean that their activity is disorganized. They are organizing just as much as the fucking card-carrying members of a party are,
Yeah, and like in terms of the collective fantasy, like it's sort of that you have the vanguard party, and then like Putin starting the invasion of Ukraine, they just um, they just put out the call for the rev, and then it just happens because everybody is fully collectivized and everything is regimented, and it's just like you're moving out like literal regiments of troops that have been trained and disciplined and follow orders to the T. Yeah, which is like a fantasy of revolution, but it has no real correspondence to any revolution that like a Leninist party actually was engaged in.
Yeah, exactly. Especially not the main Leninist revolution. Like, God, no. That was a chaotic fucking mess as well,
No, I mean like Lenin's coup to take over was like that, but it wasn't a revolution. It was just a coup. It's like the revolution stuff had already happened, and then Lenin just decided to, take power from Kerensky, who was in a very weak position. And the Bolsheviks, like the sort of activist cadres in St. Petersburg, they were actually very organized, but the effect that they had was just to take power within that very local context, and there was no actual like connection to society beyond that at that point in time. It was just purely a seizure of state power.
Yeah, right. And like the the thing here is that, like, I mean, we could probably with it's true of that example as well, right? That like, what's actually real, like the real composition of these movements is this nebula of diverse groups of various sizes, unaffiliated people, you know, overlapping spaces and forces, and feedback loops between the sort of relatively organized and relatively disorganized kind of layers and segments and recursive nested systems. It's an extremely complex sort of way of reality is hyper complex, and like social reality is no different from that. Like it's and political action is also hyper complex in that same way.
Like just think about how like gay marriage in the US was something that basically was done because, you know, there was a very specific group of Republicans who were on board with that agenda, very rich, and happened to get it through into a legislative context, right? Like, that is not anywhere near the model of there's a unitary party, right? Like, that was something that was existing on the fringes of a whole bunch of different political actions by all kinds of different organizations and all kinds of people, like you said, who were, you know, maybe just becoming slightly less homophobic over time as a result of many different pushes by many different organizations. And so, you know, it's yeah, like to say it was either just something that happened randomly as a result of aggregates, or to say that it was the result of, like, I don't know, like the 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 National Gay Party. It's just, they're both absurd, right? Like, they don't correspond. Or if you like look at, say, like the Vietnam War, right? Like, you know, you have like the Khmer Rouge, or sorry, not the Khmer Rouge. Oh God, they were around, but not relevant to the context exactly. Yeah, but you have the VC, right, and you have the North Vietnamese Communist Party, and they're like two rather different parties that were engaged in different activities at different points in time, and it's a really sort of chaotic, negotiated, semi-antagonistic relationship between them, at all kinds of different levels that ended up causing the victory over the U.S. It's not you know, it's not a matter of purely the North Vietnamese running everything and winning, or just, you know, spontaneous peasant revolution in the South. It's all kinds of different actors engaged in the situation.
Yeah, it's a distributed action is the rule. That's how things actually work. The this is one of the bits where the author actually does take aim more so at the verticalists, right? That like if we're going to understand how organization works, we can't start from trying to understand it in terms of organizations. We have to begin from a sort of bottom up perspective of looking at how organization works for actors, both individual and groups, actually coordinating their actions in this kind of mixed context, not starting from building the party as an edict. You know?
Well, yeah, it's like even before you get to the critique of the specific prescriptive Leninist party form, you can just say that, you know, organizations are not definitive of organization as a social phenomenon, right?
As a process, right? You know, organization as a noun versus organization as a process verb that is constantly going on, even in the absence of those named nouns.
Yeah, and a lot of this, you know, like I've been working with process philosophy for work for my PhD research, and a lot of this sort of rhymes with process philosophy of saying like, well, these things that you think are, you know, sort of stable entities are actually processes. Yeah.
In the next section, which I think has quite a lovely little title, Think and Act Global and Local, which I think is a really good kind of summary of the whole book, really. We take this kind of turn from the ought to the is, right? Like looking at political organization in these like plural terms, and kind of doing these reality checks, and like this is where we get to like the climate crisis, like that, like the. And this is where he switches aim, right? Like he's just taken aim at the verticalists, and now he's taking aim at the horizontalists, right? Like that, the climate crisis is too large in scope and too severe for any of these like local first or local only initiatives to have any impact on it. It is absolutely imperative that organization manage to scale to an actually global scale from and including those local initiatives, but it's very clear that the local only mode of politics is just a dead end with the climate crisis.
Yeah, like it's to say that the stakes are very high, and so to intentionally pursue being ineffective is,
It's self-sabotage.
I mean, it's massively destructive and basically suicidal. And so, you know, it's like now is not the time for that kind of approach. It's not like, you know, enormous organizations in the world today are floundering around helplessly trying to address this, and at the same time we have local organizations floundering around being ineffective, and you know, neither of those is able to provide any kind of solution to this crisis, and so we've got to try to do something better than that.
There's a lovely point here that I think might be elaborated a bit more later on, but it's kind of hard to tell because like there's some reiteration going on across chapters here. But that part of the problem with the kind of local fetish stuff is that it kind of hinges on this belief. It's like the butterfly effect, essentially, that like a butterfly can flap its wings and cause a tornado in fucking Texas or whatever. But there's like it's a kind of faith in like the ability of very, very small initiatives to have outsized global impacts, which can happen. But what the author points out here is that like it kind of misses a lot of like stuff that you just get in complexity science and cybernetics, where you know social systems put a lot of energy into suppressing local variations and to dampening variability and dampening shockwaves. And so overall, tiny disturbances locally don't go anywhere. As I think it doesn't take much of a genius to look around at our social reality and conclude that either, right?
Yeah, it says what political readings of nonlinearity tended to neglect, however, was not only that we are not necessarily always in the vicinity of a critical threshold, but the two essential concepts of nucleation and critical size. Together, they indicate that so as to be capable of propagating across a system and transforming it, a fluctuation must not only start from a certain point, it does not occur everywhere at once, but this starting point must be large enough to withstand the negative feedback mechanisms that will dampen fluctuations and inhibit change.
Yeah, basic cybernetics, right? That like a system will do negative feedback to dampen oscillations. And so in like basically like your tiny local initiative isn't going to necessarily propagate and spread like wildfire. It'll be dampened. It's basic cybernetics, like, and in order to get over that, you'd have to organize to a sufficient scale where you could overwhelm the dampeners,
Yes, so it sort of follows, right? Like the argument is organization is required for being effective to have a outsized force, and an outsized force is required to have to overcome the negative feedback mechanisms of the system. So if you don't have any organization, and we take it as a given that, these changes don't happen everywhere at once without any reason, then you're going to need to have some kind of organization in order to have that large effect that will overcome the dampening negative feedback.
Next section then is about the traumas of organization. Yeah, I don't know. Like, have we talked a lot about this sort of thing? That like, the left is kind of shying away from. Like again, so it's necessary to organize to transform our potentia into potestas or whatever. But we're so petrified of no, sorry. Like it's for our potential to go anywhere and actually challenge power, we would need to organize. But we're so afraid of that condensing into potestas and, becoming Stalinism again or whatever, that you end up with a kind of anarchistic nihilism. It would be preferable to do nothing rather than risk doing something that might concretize into power.
Yes, yeah, it's yeah, exactly. Like you would rather intentionally be ineffective than do another disastrous organizing effort. That just new boss is the same as the old boss, right? Like, we're not going to get fooled again, right? That's the classic line. And that becomes like the entirety of your politics because of the trauma, the historical trauma at this point. And I think it's also a thing of like, speaking about the sort of post-Occupy thing, the people who did go into the sectlets like are also traumatized by those experiences because they've experienced those like traumatic encounters with potestas, right? Of exploitative behavior by the sect leaders. And so that trauma is not purely historical; it's actually something that's ongoing in the left. That kind of abuse.
Yeah. And I guess the argument here is that, like, because everything is organized anyway, there's no escape from the question of organization. And so trying to flee from that into pure horizontalism doesn't get you anywhere. And like we need to organize and to be on guard. You sort of have to organize to be on guard against those potentials, those dark potentials, right?
Yes, exactly. Like you need to create organization, in sort of that like VSM way of maximizing autonomy while still being effective. And there's also the thing where Nunes talks about organization as a pharmacon. It's a term that he takes from Derrida. So essentially, a pharmacon is a remedy and poison, and necessarily both things at once. It is impossible to pin down as either pole of a binary, good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, advantageous or harmful, and so on. So it's like, because organization is already everywhere, because it has this potential to amplify the efficacy of the oppressed, and do good things, but at the same time, it can become potestas and sort of become its own form of oppression. It is a pharmacon, and it sort of made me think of like the dilemmas of the COVID vaccine. COVID vaccines is it's like it's very much like a pharmacon as well, at least for myself, right? Where it's like I take the COVID vaccines because I don't want to get COVID. I know very well how horrible COVID is, but my body reacts very negatively to those vaccines, and it takes me out of operation for like 1 to 2 weeks every single time I take it. So it is actually like a kind of poison to me, and it has a really negative effect on my health. But I take it anyway because, I don't want to get COVID, right? And so, like, there's sort of an inability to think the pharmacon I think, in that discourse, right? Of like, well, I don't want to take the vaccine because I don't want to have these negative side effects. But then also, like, it's like either or. Like, you can only see the vaccine as a cure or the vaccine as a poison, but you can't think the vaccine as a pharmacon.
Yeah, as a mixed thing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And I think that's been a lot of the discourse around the COVID vaccination thing, and also we see it in discussion of organization, as Nunes says here.
Yeah, right. That like organization is a matter of these mixed trade-offs, and those trade-offs are there regardless of your ideological commitments, right? Like somebody who's a committed Leninist is going to face the same kind of trade-off as somebody who's a committed whatever the opposite is, right? Like it's regardless of what you think and what your emotional commitments are, this stuff is real, and you have to deal with it.
The other thing that he brings up that I think is resonant about the trauma is that our trauma reaction to the catastrophes of organization in the 20th century desensitizes us to the trauma of the effects of ongoing the ongoing lack of political organization, right? Just being atomized, just being subjected to structures of oppression it becomes sort of the water that we are fish in, and we can only fixate on the traumas of organization as opposed to all the shit we go through constantly as a result of being completely disempowered.
Yeah, like look around, motherfucker. Do you?
Yeah, like
does this look like a horizontalist wonderland to you? For fuck's sake, come on.
yeah. Like it ain't great. There's a lot of trauma of just existing in this state of continuous disempowerment, and to blind ourselves to that by fixating entirely on what happens when organization goes terribly wrong, and sort of the Soviet experience, is not a reasonable reaction if we take into account the fact that organization is already everywhere.
Yeah. It's like you're getting organized one way or the fucking other, like, and currently you're being organized by something else. You're getting fucked over by someone. The next section then, the one and or the many, is a bit long and kind of philosophically detailed, but it kind of concerns this kind of split and this oscillation between the one, like single central thing versus the many, the multitude, and that kind of stuff. And as you can probably predict, the author is going to come down somewhere in the middle in a kind of blend of the two, and actually kind of dismantle some of the kind of opposition, the kind of the binary opposition between these two things. That in reality, there's never really a one, and there's never really that many manys. It's a kind of mixed sort of thing that's going on.
Yes. We get into like a lot of like Spinoza and philosophy, just sort of doing the fundamental kind of ontological and metaphysical work. So I had one point here that I highlighted is the collective is nothing but a certain configuration of the individuals that compose it. But those individuals are constituted by the changing relations they have with one another. And so each change that each individual goes through is at the same time a change in the collective as a whole. However infinitesimal or large this might be. So, it's the aggregate doesn't exist, right? Is the point there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's no totality, right? There's just this reciprocal feedback loop between individuals in the group and between individuals and the group, and both of them are in motion, composing each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument is that there is a totality, but the totality is just the universe, right? Like there is no other totality than the universe. Everything under that is composite in terms of levels of totality. So the one is composed of many's, of many's, which, you know, have subdivisions which influence each other, right? And it's just kind of that Beerian discussion of of hierarchy, right? That where you have these relevant levels of hierarchy and the complex effects within them, and you have like the VSM, right, where it's like it's recursive, like every level down has its own internal functioning and its own internal complexities. It's not simply any homogeneous substance.
Yeah. And yeah, it kind of explodes the distinction, like, really, that because what you often get in sort of left discourse of this is like, oh, is it possible for the multitude to self-organize without a kind of like without a vertical component or something? And he's just saying, no, it's always fucking mixed. It's always this reciprocal feedback interaction between vertical and horizontal forces that, like, you know, it's all a big fucking blend. So there's you can't just posit a sort of pristine self-organizing multitude that is then infected by verticalism, nor can you posit a pristine verticalism that's infested with horizontal bullshit or something. Like, it's an insane way to think about social reality.
Yes, yeah. And another point that comes up in here that I thought was quite interesting was this point about like mimesis and imitation.
Yeah, that's our, like, for Spinoza, it's our kind of way of socially organizing, is our ability to imitate each other and to sort of effectively imitate. Like, we can feel what everyone else is feeling, and we can sort of pass along vibes and feelings to each other.
Yeah, so there's, just following the section that I read, Nunes writes, this is what Gilbert Simondon was referring to when he spoke of trans-individuality. The two individuations, psychic and collective, are reciprocal to each other. They allow us to pose the category of trans-individual as a way to account for the systematic unity of inner, that is psychic, and outer, collective individuation. What this trans-individual perspective does, however, is complicate the inside-outside, spontaneous, non-spontaneous, horizontal-vertical distinction implied in Negri's question. For if individuals spontaneously imitate one another, how can adhesion to an idea or person be described as something, quote-unquote, imposed from the outside? You know, that sort of vertical thing. Is following one another in the sense of mimetic identification not exactly what people do? Besides, imitation supposes that whatever is imitated has started somewhere. A new trend does not appear all of a sudden across a large number of people. It grows and develops as people imitate each other, which means that there must have been a wave of early imitations, and underneath it an act of invention that brought that trend into the world. So, you know, it's like it had to start somewhere. It had to be imitated by some people, and then others, and then others, and then others. And so in that sense, it's not aggregate, right? It's not aggregate and quote unquote spontaneous.
No. Yeah, right. It's kind of splitting the like leadership function from leadership position, right? Because even if there's no, like, you know, concrete leadership position, there's still leadership happening in the group and in the movement. There's still, you know, initiative actions that are then imitated and propagate as people, you know, follow each other's lead. But, you know, those initiatives can originate anywhere. It's like in beer we had the well, it was the thing about how the brain works, that it's like redundancy of potential command or something, that like any neuron can start firing the chain that the rest will follow, right? Like, it's a very distributed sort of system. But when you see actions being taken it's, I don't know, it would be sort of crazy to say that it was totally, dispersed and that there was no local chain of causes at all, right?
Yeah, like there's no actual synaptic network. Everything is just purely spontaneous and aggregate. Yeah, it says here spontaneous processes also necessarily involve quote unquote leaders, not in the sense of objects of common love through which followers identify with one another, but of sources of modulations of collective behavior that will be incorporated by others. So it's like you don't have to have the great leader or the dear leader that everyone experiences their commonality through. Um, but you do have to have a leader in the sense of following someone's lead. Like there has to be there has to be a source of action, and there has to be a causal precedent. It doesn't have to be a great leader or even a person. It could be an event that gets propagated, but there has to be some kind of propagation that happens and a before and after. Yeah.
There has to be initiative. It's yeah. I mean, if Spinoza's right, and the way that we socially organize ourselves is through this mimetic imitation and mimetic contagion, then there has to be a patient zero for any given meme, basically, right? Like there has to be an origin point, and it can propagate all over the place. But yeah, it's I don't know. It's great, like splitting out the because like the fear of the leadership position like just cows us into these kind of being unable to deal with any of this stuff, right?
Yes, and like it makes us think in these terms of like distributed spontaneity. But it's very obvious. You look at something like Occupy Wall Street, right? It's like, okay, so Adbusters calls for a protest at Wall Street. Obviously, Adbusters is not the leader of Occupy in any meaningful sense, but they did get something going, and it proceeded in a nonlinear fashion. And then from New York, you had Occupy spread to many other places. The sort of idea and the form. So Occupy Wall Street was obviously not in a leadership position over all the other occupies. Like they didn't have like a common turn that all the other occupies were responsible to or anything like that. But they were leaders in the sense that they were the vanguard, right? Like they started something, and then others imitated it.
I think maybe one final important point for this chapter is that these groups and movements, like even when there is a sort of movement formed, they're never really like a single universal subject. It's not like the group never forms like a single mind or like a brain that has like a single subjective experience. These movements and groups are always riven with like necessary tensions and conflicts and inconsistencies. So just like the notion of like a group mind that emerges, like that mind is highly fractured if it exists.
Yeah, it's like we can acknowledge at the same time that potestas potestas is the it exists. There are real structures of power and command that exist in the world that can create completely disproportionate effects, right? Like, Biden says go blow up the oil pipeline, and then the oil pipeline gets blown up. It's not like there's a sort of, a big hobnob between all the members of the U.S. military and all the affiliated governments, and everybody is completely horizontal, and Biden's voice is completely insignificant in all of this. It's actually a situation of top-down command that affects a very specific outcome, right? But that doesn't mean that within those organizations, everything is a hive mind. It's just that there are structures in place that amplify down the chain the effects of the person who's in that position of commander-in-chief, right? So it's like there can be at the same time a variety of factors acting within that organization, and the potential of the actors that are not in positions of power can be suppressed so that their point of view and their will is irrelevant to the outcome, right?
Um, and I mean, we would hope that our sort of democratic sort of paradise would be a bit more balanced in how things emerge from there. But even in that case, it's still not going to be like a single mind. It'll be a necessarily fractured thing.
Yeah, it's necessarily fractured, but also not necessarily indeterminate. You have to be able to like hold those two things in your head at the same time, that both can exist, right? Power structures can exist, and at the same time, there are no hive minds in reality.
Okay, let's do chapter 2, One or Two Melancholias, which I found to be a very interesting kind of overview of some of the history of the left, but I guess the broad point is that by now there's really two lefts that share a kind of common experience of defeat, but have split into this kind of bifurcated mode with like mutual recrimination between the two sides, reinforcing the split. That's the takeaway.
Yes. Yeah, because essentially the point is that in the telling of the history of the left, you have the sort of new left moment in the 60s and early 70s, right? And that is portrayed sort of purely through the terms of, don't trust anyone over 30, right? Like that phrase, the initial usage of that phrase was to like, don't trust anyone from the old left was the meaning of that phrase, right? It was like people in California who were operating in left contexts and were suspicious of people who had come up through the sort of 1917 inspired left Leninist movement, right? So everything is seen, you're either new left or you're old left, right? But what Nunes is saying is if you actually look at the 68 movement, the 68 moment and the politics of the 60s and early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, I should say, it's not really that clear cut. And you have maybe the sort of embryonic form of the new left coming about in that time. But like, the Panthers were neo-Maoists, right? Like they were still a part of that tradition. And, you had Marxists on the streets in 68 who weren't necessarily dyed-in-the-wool partisans of the PCF and saying, pump the brakes, stop the rev, right? So there is more ambiguity to that split in that actual period of time. But what Nunes is proposing is that when the left was crushed in that sort of Thatcher period, that 80s period, right? He says late 70s, but actually I think you could probably track it to like post 73. It's kind of after the oil shock is when things really start to go downhill in a hurry. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that it's with that crushing defeat that you get the split into two camps, like a real split into two camps with two sort of mutually antagonistic memories of what happened in the mid 20th century and in the early 20th century sort of Leninist wave of revolutions.
Yeah, exactly. The split is more recent than those events, right? Like it's kind of because like he's going off of Wendy Brown and Jodie Dean were writing in like the 2000s basically and onwards. And then it's especially then once you get to like the failures of the ultra globalization movement, which at 90s, right, like Battle of Seattle stuff, right, like where that was still a kind of it was still a mixed bag, right? There were still kind of vertical and horizontal elements around there, but that kind of crashed on the rocks. And then you get to 2011, which was all horizontal all the time, and that crashed even harder, even faster, and that just deepens this kind of entrenched resentment of two sides, right? Like, and it's the mutual recrimination of like it's kind of each side blaming the other for betrayal, right? Like the kind of the the old left are blamed for having this nostalgic attachment to these old forms, and for betraying the new left basically, and then the new left are accused of betraying the revolution or abandoning social conflict entirely. This is a mutually constituted death spiral where, because you have this hard division, it becomes kind of impossible, and you have this other target for recrimination. It becomes kind of impossible to understand yourself at that point. Like, you can't see your own failings, you can only see the failings of the other, even though the two sides really should see it as a shared defeat and should come to terms with it and understand what the fuck happened, what's going on, understand the tidal shifts over time, the various ways these kind of because like it's not like the 1917 moment didn't have its horizontal elements, you know what I mean? Like, it's these elements of left organizing have always been there. It's just that now we've kind of settled into this very sad, repetitive recrimination based on identification with one element or the other.
Yeah, and I think that this there's a lot of things to say about this chapter, but I think one thing it tends towards is sort of a call for left unity under a different programmatic banner, right? So it's not left unity in the sense that all platforms are equally valid, blah blah blah. It's left unity under what if we were to think about organization in a different way, right? But I think that experience sort of shows that left unity, if it means bringing in Stalinists, is basically a dead end. Like, you can't do that
because they'll contaminate your stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're just going to wreck everything, right? In the name of establishing potestas. And that's not coming from a place of, when we started this podcast, we were quite open-minded about these questions. I think as many people were at that point in time. And it's really only through historical examination and of like, okay, what happens when Leninists take power? What are the effects of the Leninist party form? What's the context in which it was formed? And what effects do like Leninist parties have today in the world? That I at least sort of came to this anti-Leninist point of view, especially by seeing things like attempts to establish left unity recently, and just see them go nowhere because of the same pattern repeating itself. So it's not that I'm opposed to organization; it's that I'm opposed to that particular form of organization, and so
I'm opposed to Leninists.
So I don't think that left unity is something that has legs in that sense, right? Like it's we can't paper over that difference just because in principle organization is necessary and valuable. It doesn't mean we should accept that form of organization. It's just something I wanted to say because this book does kind of tend towards the direction of, well, we need to do a big tent. And it's not to say they don't have criticisms of the Leninist tradition, but that you could take that logic out of it and say, well, why don't we just cooperate? We'll figure out our differences, et cetera, et cetera. but you can't really do that when the person on the other side of the negotiating table is profoundly dishonest about, like sort of methodologically dishonest in the way that they do politics, because it's baked into that particular reified form of partisanship.
Yeah. They're not working in good faith with you. It is interesting because, like, right at the back of the chapter, the author does sort of say something similar, that, like, because there's this long section on organization as mediation, and then at the very back it's like, well, you know, there are some kind of mediations that can just be dismissed out of hand. Like, you just don't truck with bigots or fucking mentalists or, you know, Leninist psychos or whatever. That, like, you know, he ends up saying it's not always a matter of the golden mean. You can just sort of reject some of these things entirely, as being like, no, one pole of the opposition here is unambiguously better than the other. But
well, and I mean, the whole point is to say, fuck the polls, right? Like, let's think in terms of sort of localized concentrations on a spectrum. And it you know, it's kind of like when you're doing audio editing, and in the, like, you know, 10,000 hertz part of the audio spectrum, you have a horrible, like, staticky spike that's just awful to your ears. It's okay to just filter that out.
get rid of it. Right? Yeah, totally.
It's on a spectrum, but it doesn't mean that there aren't, like, sort of qualitative differences along that spectrum, right? Or that there are things you might want or not want. In the same way that somebody who's like, you know, at every possible opportunity to do something effective is just going to be a wrecker and say, no, like, that's too dictatorial. Like, we can't do that. We need to disorganize ourselves immediately. Like people who are just there to pump the brakes constantly and create chaos can also be filtered out of that discussion, right? Because they're not honestly interested in organizing. And I think that's true of both of these sort of reified forms of politics that we are being criticized in this book.
Yeah, because fuck them, they don't need to be here. So, like, I mean, I kind of want to give a fairly quick summary of this section because it is interesting, but it's a bit too detailed. Like, organization as mediation, right? So, like, I mean, it does what it says, right? Like, that organization mediates between apparent dualisms like theory and practice, or spontaneity and purposefulness, economic and political struggles, vertical and horizontal, masses and leaders, you know, the inside and the outside. There's a lot of mediations going on, and organization picks and chooses and filters and compresses and, you know, makes these things work. But, like, we have a tendency to see these things in, like, terms of exclusive disjunctions. Like, we do either micropolitics or macropolitics. It's either vertical or horizontal. But organization finds the, you know, place that the slider is supposed to be set to for a given context. I loved a little bit then, like, the section on, like, force over form. Because how does this go, right? So, like, you know, when you have these apparent binary oppositions, you can kind of think of them in terms of, like, logical contradictions, in terms of, like, where one negates the other. So it's either A or B. If B is present, A can't be present. And then if you're going to mediate these things in logical terms, you need, like, a synthesis. This is, you know, Hegel stuff, right, where there's some higher form that unifies the two terms or whatever.
Yeah, it says, what mediation must do in this case is bring the two predicates together in a third term that would be their synthesis. Given that we are dealing with a logical contradiction, the problem, the contradiction, is in principle solved as soon as the solution, the synthesis, appears, by means of a third term that at once cancels and conserves them in a higher unity. It will be possible from that moment on to predicate the two previously incompatible terms from the same subject. So that's at the logical level, right? That you have two incompatible opposites, and then you find a synthetic term that will recontextualize them into something that is mediated.
Yeah. And in the history of Marxism, like, the synthetic term is the party, right? Like, it's everything is synthesized into the party form, right? And this is all very singular. There's a singular kind of posing of the problem of the contradiction, and then there's a singular answer of this like single form, the party. That becomes your prescription for how to go about everything. It's going to be it's like Lukács stuff, right? Like it's going to be all party all the time because of this.
Yeah, just to go turbo Hegel. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like you can probably see the problem here, listeners, right? That like this is a transplanting of a mathematical logical concept into real world politics. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that like real political forces don't conform to logical structures, you know.
Yes. So the sort of carry on from that is Nunes writes, in short, real opposition is not an opposition between concepts, but between real forces or tendencies. And whereas two concepts that logically negate each other produce no reality, but only impossible entities like the square circle, opposed forces can come into all sorts of mixtures bearing all sorts of proportions. Alternatively, we could say that the real opposition is not an opposition between determinate qualities, but between quantities, vectorial quantities endowed with both magnitude and direction, as in Kant's example of the two forces acting on a body, or intensive quantities, that is, those that are non-additive, not composed of smaller quantities of the same kind. When we call an object hot or cold, we are registering the physical sensation of a change of state in our body occasioned by coming in contact with that object. Yet the fact that the verbal resources we have to do so make us ascribe a determinate quality to it, hot or cold, should not blind us to the fact that what we are doing is describing an intensive difference between the object and our body. It is hotter or colder than we are. Many of the qualities that we regularly ascribe to things, heavy, light, wet, or dry, function in this way. What they name is a quantum of some property, weight, temperature, humidity, resulting from an intensive or vectorial relation. They correspond to definite quantities produced by a real opposition. For example, the quality of heavy that we predicate of an object names the excess of the downward pull of gravity on its mass over the upward traction that we exert on it. That such differential relations differ from determinate states and that the former are the origin of the latter is an idea that we can trace as far back as the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander. So, we get into it, with like the real philosophical stuff, but the point is essentially to map this opposition between determinate qualities and definite quantities onto the vertical, horizontal opposition of determinate qualities and the actually existing reality of varying degrees of organization.
Right. Yeah. It's varying. The varying degrees thing like that. It's the key thing there of like real oppositions have this character of being varying degrees in relation to something, right? Like you mix red and blue paint, and depending on the quantities that you mix them in, you can just say it's redder or bluer. You can't really posit red and blue as like polar logical opposites that negate each other. Same for hot, cold, heavy, light.
Yeah, even to say, like take the sort of RGB scale and max it out at 255 red does not mean that is like the platonic red, right? It is not absolute, right? So to sort of sum this up, Nunes writes, specifically, the abstraction lies in treating absolute qualities which only indicate the two opposing directions in which an indefinite dyad stretches, that is more or less, as if they were actual entities between which one could and in fact should decide. opting for horizontality or verticality in absolute terms is like choosing the cold in itself or the hot in itself, when cold and hot exist only as definite quantities arising from differences in vectors or intensities, and the qualities that describe any single thing at any given time are only the balance of the differential relations acting on it. What exists is never this or that isolated element or quality, but only mixtures. The individual being is no longer an absolute unity, but the stability of a relation. And so that's what actually exists in the world, as opposed to, you know, the absolute concept of the Leninist party, right? Or the multitude.
Right, precisely, right, because those just aren't opposites of each other in that sense, right? They're not logically opposed terms. Like we have to see organized mediation and organization as balance between forces, not as a form which resolves a logical contradiction. Also, like, I don't know, it's one of these really lovely, clear things that, like, just casts actually a really damning light on, like, the history of Marxism, like, you know, like, that, like, just this central fuck-up of projecting logical sort of terms and Hegel onto actual processes and sort of insisting that that makes any fucking sense, you know?
Yeah, well, it's to say... It's to, like, we get into this more in the next chapter, but essentially it's to work something through in your mind logically and then try to reduce the variety of the situation down to that sort of one-bit conclusion that you can get out of a logical proposition, right? Like, it's like it is it's not to say that thinking logically is wrong. It's to elevate logical conclusions to the point that you ignore any kind of existing opposition of forces in, like, you know, really existing quantities, right? This reminds me a lot of sort of the problem with the Austrian school, right? Where it's like in especially in Mises, but also in Hayek, you have like you get the sort of logical proof that socialist calculation is impossible. Right. And that's taken as definitive because, you know, logic is superior to empiricism. But then you have, like, what we saw with the People's Republic of Walmart, where engineers just, like, actually do the fucking thing.
Just actually did it, right?
In terms of calculation, in a way that refutes the logical deliberations of the Austrian school. But, you know, if you are stuck in that sort of abstract, theoretical, logical game that the Austrians set up, you can't even acknowledge the reality of the technology that exists, right? Because existence is irrelevant compared to the logical calculus that just like completely filters it out from your perception.
Yeah, crazy shit to reflect on, that this is actually things people do.
Well, I mean, this is why people hate academics, right?
Yeah, 'cause they're awful.
Like, it's one reason why people hate academics is because you could go down these like theoretical rabbit holes. Or extremely myopic rabbit holes that are encouraged by your specialization, and just sort of miss, like, you know, things that are around you in reality because you've become such a sensitive apparatus for studying a particular thing that you can't see anything else. It's all filtered out.
Well, that's it for this episode. We hope you'll join us again next time for part 2 of our discussion of neither vertical nor horizontal. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook and all the podcast apps, so like, rate and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show and get access to our community Discord, go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month. Your support is always greatly appreciated. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as From Alpha to Omega, Jumpsuit Utopia, and Swampside Chats. They're all excellent shows and excellent folks. Once again, thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.